The silence was the first thing I noticed when I arrived, and I had a feeling it would be the last. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, weighted with the rustle of wind through dry grass, the distant lowing of cattle, and the creak of old wood settling under a vast, unforgiving sky. My life back in the city had been a symphony of noise, sirens, traffic, the incessant chatter of people I didn't know and had no desire to. I'd come here, to the broken heart of Montana, chasing this quiet, hoping it would seep into the cracks of my own fractured existence and fill the hollow spaces. My name is Leo, and for the better part of a decade, I had been a ghost in my own story. I worked a graphic design job that paid the bills but starved my soul, lived in an apartment that felt more like a storage unit for my body, and cultivated a spectacular talent for being forgettable. I was the guy you'd pass on the street and not see, the name on an email you'd delete without reading. I existed in the margins, an observer by trade and by nature. When my grandfather, a man I'd only known through faded photographs and his yearly Christmas card with a crisp $20 bill inside, left me a small inheritance, I didn't invest it or buy a new car. I quit my job, packed a single duffel bag, and answered an online ad for a seasonal ranch hand. It was the least logical, most impulsive thing I had ever done. It felt like a gasp for air after years of holding my breath. The Double T Ranch was less of a sprawling Western fantasy and more of a study in functional decay. The main house sagged a little to the left, the barns wore their peeling red paint like old scars, and the fences stretched for miles in a determined, if not always straight, line. It was perfect. It was real. It didn't ask me to be anything other than a pair of hands. And then I saw him. Cole. He was the ranch foreman, a fact I learned later. My first impression was one of stillness. While the other hands moved with a restless energy, shouting greetings and slapping backs, Cole stood by the corral, one boot resting on the lowest rail. He was just watching. He was tall, built with the kind of lean, dense muscle that comes from labor, not a gym. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind into something that was handsome in a way that felt ancient and unadorned. His eyes, when they briefly flicked to me, were the color of faded denim, and they held the same vast, unreadable quality as the sky above us. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod in my direction before turning his attention back to a skittish-looking mare. That was it. No introduction, no handshake. Just a silent acknowledgement that I now occupied a space within his orbit. My heart, a sluggish and unreliable organ, gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. It was the same feeling you get when you stand at the edge of a cliff, a mix of terror and a bizarre, magnetic pull. In that moment, watching this quiet, grounded man, I felt the full, crushing weight of my own transience. I was a tourist in this life, and he was the landscape itself. The first few weeks were a blur of aching muscles and humbling incompetence. I, who had considered assembling an IKEA bookshelf a major feat of engineering, was now expected to mend barbed wire, muck out stalls, and haul hay bales that seemed to be filled with lead. I was clumsy. I was slow. I was a city boy in every sense of the word, and the other hands let me know it with a steady stream of good-natured, and sometimes not so good-natured, ribbing. Hey, Picasso, you hold a hammer like it's a paintbrush. One of them, a wiry cowboy named Jed, had called out one afternoon. I just smiled weakly and tried to drive the nail straight. Cole never joined in. He didn't offer praise, either. He just watched. His presence was a constant, a quiet pressure at the edge of my awareness. He would show me how to do something once, his movements economical and precise. He'd demonstrate how to properly wrap a wire, his large, calloused hands working with a surprising grace. His voice was a low rumble, always calm, always direct. Keep the tension even, he'd say, his gaze fixed on my fumbling fingers, not my face. Don't rush it. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. He wasn't judging, not exactly. He was assessing, gauging my worth, my use. And I found myself desperately wanting to measure up. My primary job became fence mending. It was solitary work, which suited me. I'd take a truck out to the far pastures, the rattling of tools and the drone of the engine, my only companions. But from my vantage point on the rolling hills, I could often see him. I'd watch Cole on his horse, a dark, solid shape moving against the endless green and gold. He rode not like a man on a horse, but like they were a single being, a centaur of the modern West. He had a way of communicating with the animals, a low word, a gentle touch to the neck, that was both commanding and tender. I spent hours observing him, learning the rhythm of his day, the set of his shoulders when he was tired, the slight tilt of his head when he was listening to the wind. It became a kind of secret addiction, this observation. I was cataloging the man, piece by piece. The way the sun bleached the tips of his dark brown hair. The network of fine lines that fanned out from the corners of his eyes when he squinted at the horizon. The scent that clung to him. Not cologne, but something far more elemental. Leather, sweat, dust, and the clean, sharp smell of the pines. I was doing what I always did, watching from a safe distance. But this felt different. It wasn't passive. It was active, hungry. It was a yearning so profound it felt like a physical ache in my chest. I would analyze every brief interaction we had, replaying it in my mind for hours under the thin blanket in my bunkhouse bed. One morning, he handed me a thermos of coffee as I was heading out. "Long day," was all he said. My fingers brushed against his as I took it. His skin was warm, rough. The contact lasted no more than a second, but a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I spent the rest of the day thinking about it. Was it an accident? A simple gesture of kindness? Or was there something else in the way his gaze had held mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary? I was a connoisseur of micro-expressions, a scholar of unspoken things, and Cole was the most complex text I had ever tried to read. He was a fortress of self-containment, and I was laying siege with nothing but my own foolish, hopeful interpretations. Another time, I was struggling to load a heavy post onto the truck bed. I saw him approaching from the corner of my eye. I braced myself for a critique, a sigh of exasperation. Instead, he just came up behind me, placed his hands over mine on the rough wood, and said, together his body was close, the heat of him radiating against my back. His voice was a low vibration right by my ear. We lifted it easily. He didn't let go right away. His hands lingered over mine, his thumbs pressing lightly into my knuckles. "There," he said, his voice softer than usual. He stepped back, and the space he left behind felt suddenly, painfully cold. I told myself I was imagining it. I was a lonely man in a new place, projecting my own desperate need for connection onto the first person who showed me a sliver of consideration. Cole was just a decent boss. That was all. He was probably married, with a wife and a brood of kids in a neat little house in town. I had never seen him with anyone, but men like him, steady, capable, quietly handsome, were never single for long. To think otherwise was to indulge in a fantasy that could only lead to disappointment. So I tried to push it down, to file my observations under professional curiosity, but my heart wasn't listening to the logic of my brain. It kept beating a little faster every time he was near, a frantic, hopeful drum against my ribs. The landscape was changing. The vibrant greens of summer were slowly surrendering to the muted golds and browns of autumn. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decay. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. My hands, once soft and pale, were now calloused and tanned. The work, which had once felt impossible, was now simply hard, a familiar ache in my bones at the end of each day. I was changing with the season, becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. I was quieter, maybe, but also more solid. I felt more present in my own skin than I had in years. And the tension with Cole continued to build, a low hum beneath the surface of our daily routines. It was in the shared silences that felt more communicative than conversation. It was in the way he started seeking me out to work with him on tasks that didn't strictly require two people. We'd spend hours riding the property line, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the steady plod of the horse's hooves. He started talking more, not about anything deep, but about the land, the history of the ranch, the names of the constellations that blazed in the ink-black sky at night. I learned that he had grown up here, that the ranch had been in his mother's family for generations. He'd left for a while after high school, joined the army, saw things he didn't talk about, and then came back. "This is the only place that ever made sense," he told me one evening, his eyes on the distant mountains turning purple in the twilight. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared, and I held it like a precious, fragile gift. "What about you, Leo?" he asked, turning that steady gaze on me. What are you running from? It was the same question he'd asked before, but this time it felt different. Less like a casual inquiry, and more like he genuinely wanted to know. I surprised myself by telling him the truth. Not all of it, but a piece. I wasn't running from something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I think I was running to something. I just didn't know what. He didn't press. He just nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement of his head. He looked back at the mountains. Sometimes you find it where you least expect, he said. And in the deepening gloom, I couldn't tell if he was talking about the land or about something else entirely. The first snow came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that clung to the fences and turned the world silent and white. With it came a change in the work. We were preparing for winter, reinforcing structures, stockpiling feed, bringing the herds down from the high pastures. The urgency created a new kind of intimacy, a shared purpose against the coming cold. One afternoon, a late-season squall blew in without warning, a furious blast of wind and blinding snow. Cole and I were out checking on a section of the herd that had been slow to move down. Within minutes, the world was a swirling vortex of white. Visibility dropped to near zero. "We need to find shelter," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "There's an old line shack about a mile east of here." He took the lead, his horse a dark, reassuring presence in the chaos. I followed, trusting him completely. It was a primal sort of trust, the kind you place in someone who holds your survival in their hands. We found the shack, a small, dilapidated log cabin that looked like it might collapse under the weight of the snow. Inside, it was dark, cold, and smelled of mice and damp earth. But it was shelter. We unsaddled the horses and led them into the small, lean-to stable attached to the cabin. We worked together in the cramped space, our movements synchronized by necessity. Our shoulders brushed, our hands bumped as we worked the stiff buckles. Every touch was an accident, and every accident felt like a deliberate spark in the freezing air. Inside the one-room cabin, we managed to get a fire going in the small, rusty wood stove. The flames cast a flickering, golden light on the rough-hewn walls, pushing back the encroaching darkness. We stripped off our wet outer layers and hung them near the stove to dry. I was left in my Henley shirt and jeans, shivering slightly. Cole, in a similar state of dress, seemed completely unaffected by the cold. The firelight played across the muscles of his back and shoulders, turning his ordinary form into something sculpted and mythic. We sat on the floor before the stove, sharing the beef jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. The silence in the cabin was different from the open-air silence of the ranch. It was enclosed, concentrated. It pressed in on us, magnifying the sound of our own breathing, the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside. "We'll be stuck here till morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the old wood. "I figured," I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady. My nerves were frayed, a combination of the near disaster outside and the overwhelming proximity of the man beside me. He was so close I could feel the heat coming off his body, a stark contrast to the chill that still clung to my bones. He turned to look at me, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. His expression was serious, his blue eyes searching my face. "You were good out there today, Leo. You kept your head." The unexpected praise warmed me more than the fire. "I just followed you." "That's not always easy to do," he said. He held my gaze for a long moment. I felt stripped bare, as if he could see right through the carefully constructed walls I'd spent a lifetime building. I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not assessment, not curiosity, but a deep, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was a look of profound loneliness. "I am here. My mind screams it. I am right here. See me." But I said nothing. I just looked back at him, my heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. The space between us was charged, electric with unspoken words and possibilities. The storm raged outside, a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside me. He was going to kiss me. I was sure of it. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. But the moment passed. He blinked, and the vulnerability was gone, replaced by his usual stoic mask. He shifted his position, turning back to the fire. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice rough. "We'll have a long ride back tomorrow." I lay down on the dusty floor, using my jacket as a pillow, my back to him. But sleep was impossible. I was acutely aware of him, of his presence in the small room. I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. I could feel him, like a magnetic pull on my own atoms. I had come to this place seeking solitude, a way to disappear. Instead, I had found the one person in the world who made me feel painfully, incandescently visible. And I didn't know if that was a blessing or a curse. The storm broke just before dawn. We rode back to the main house in a world made new, pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. The awkwardness from the night before clung to us like a shroud. We barely spoke. Back at the bunkhouse, the other hands clapped us on the back, relieved to see us safe. Jed made a crude joke about us having a cozy night together, and I felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up my neck. I glanced at Cole, expecting him to make a joke back, to deflect. Instead, he just gave Jed a flat, cold look. "Shut up, Jed," he said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. Jed, for all his bluster, immediately fell silent. Cole's gaze then found mine across the room. It was a look of protection, of solidarity. It was an apology for the night before, and a promise. I just didn't know what it was a promise of. The days that followed were a return to a strange kind of normal. The snow melted under a surprisingly warm sun, and the work continued. But something had irrevocably shifted between us. The tension was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a tangible thing, a third presence that followed us everywhere. The accidental touches became less accidental. A hand on my back to guide me through a gate, lingering a moment too long. His fingers brushing mine as he passed me a canteen, a deliberate, featherlight stroke. We were orbiting each other, caught in a gravitational pull that was growing stronger by the day. We were two celestial bodies on an inevitable collision course. I lived in a state of constant, heightened awareness. My entire being was attuned to him. I knew the sound of his footsteps, the specific cadence of his cough, the way he cleared his throat before he was about to give an order. My world had shrunk, and he was at the center of it, the sun around which my lonely planet revolved. I was going insane with this silent, desperate wanting. The tipping point came on a bright, cold afternoon a week after the storm. We were out on the high eastern pasture, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a falling tree. The air was thin and clean, and you could see for 100 miles in every direction. The world felt vast and empty, except for us. There was a post that needed resetting on a steep incline. I was trying to reach the top wire to secure it, but I was just a few inches too short. I was stretching, my fingers straining, grunting with frustration. "Here," Cole said from behind me. I expected him to offer me a tool, or to take over the task himself. Instead, he moved to stand directly in front of me. His body blocked the sun, casting me in his shadow. "What?" I asked, my voice coming out breathy. He didn't answer. He just bent slightly, and before I could process what was happening, his hands were on my waist. They were strong and sure, his palms warm even through the fabric of my jacket and shirt. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing. The world tilted, my stomach swooped, and then my boots were landing softly on the top rail of the fence. I was suddenly at eye level with him, perched precariously on the thin strip of wood. I grabbed onto the fence post to steady myself, my knuckles white. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my chest, beating its wings against my ribs. "Hold on," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly thing that vibrated right through me. And he didn't let go. His hands stayed on my waist, his thumbs rubbing small, slow circles against my hip bones. It was an anchor, a brand. His face was only inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he breathed. The vast world of mountains and sky disappeared. My universe was now the 6 inches of space between our faces. This is it. The thought is a thunderclap in the silence of my mind. I can't breathe. I can't think. All I can do is feel. I feel the rough bark of the fence post under my fingers, the solid weight of his hands on my body, the cool wind on my face, and the searing heat of his gaze. He is looking at me with an intensity that strips away every defense I have ever known. He is looking at me like he's been starving, and I am the first real meal he's seen in years. "Cole," I whispered, his name a prayer or a plea, I wasn't sure which. "Leo," he breathed back. His eyes flickered down to my mouth, and then back up to my eyes. The question was there, hanging in the charged air between us. He was asking for permission. He was giving me a choice. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was an active participant in my own story, not just a narrator. I could stop this. I could get down, make a joke, pretend this moment never happened, and go back to the safe, lonely silence. Or I could choose. I leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch. It was the smallest movement, but it was an answer. It was a yes. A silent scream of yes that had been building inside me for months. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a grin. It was something softer, more private. It was a smile of recognition, of relief. He tightened his grip on my waist, pulling me even closer, until the front of my body was flush against his. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart against my own frantic one. He lifted one hand from my waist and brought it to my face. His calloused thumb traced the line of my jaw, a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. He was still looking at me, his eyes asking one last time if I was sure. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he closed the distance. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't hungry or desperate. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a conversation we had been trying to have for months, finally spoken in a language we both understood. His lips were firm and warm, chapped from the wind. He tasted of coffee and the cold, clean air. It was a kiss of discovery, of confirmation. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you'd never been before. I melted into him, my hands leaving the safety of the fence post to tangle in his thick hair. He groaned softly, a low sound deep in his chest, and pulled me tighter against him, one hand splayed against the small of my back, holding me in place. It was everything. It was the end of the silence and the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. It was terrifying and beautiful, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, it was real. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and steady. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. There was only the feeling of it, a profound and seismic shift in the landscape of my soul. He had lifted me onto a fence rail, and in doing so, had lifted me out of the half-life I had been living. Later that night, the bunkhouse was a cacophony of noise. Men talking, laughing, a radio playing a tinny country song. It was the same as any other night, but for me, everything was different. I felt like I was glowing in the dark, like everyone must be able to see what had happened, that it was written all over my face. I kept stealing glances at Cole. He was leaning against the wall, nursing a beer, participating in the conversations around him with his usual economy of words. He looked exactly the same, but every now and then, his eyes would find mine across the room, and the look he gave me was a secret, a promise, a continuation of the conversation we had started on that fence line. I couldn't stand it. The noise, the people, the suffocating normalcy of it all. I needed air. I slipped out the back door and into the sharp, cold night. The sky was a riot of stars, a spray of diamonds on black velvet. I walked until the sounds of the bunkhouse faded, until it was just me and the vast, silent land. My mind was racing. What did this mean? Was it a one-time thing, a moment of impulse driven by isolation and proximity? Or was it the start of something? The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. I was an expert at being alone. I had no idea how to be with someone, especially not someone like Cole, who felt as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon. I felt fragile, breakable. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me, and I tensed. I turned to see his silhouette approaching, dark against the starlight. He stopped a few feet away from me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I don't know what this is." He was silent for a moment, just looking at me. Then he closed the distance between us. He didn't touch me, not at first. He just stood in front of me, a warm, solid presence in the cold night. "I'm not good with words, Leo," he said, his voice low and rough. "Never have been. I don't know how to do this." All the talking, he took a breath. "But I know what I felt today, up on that ridge. And I know it wasn't just nothing." He reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his calloused palm warm and dry against my own. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more intimate, more binding than the kiss. It was a conscious choice, a statement. It wasn't nothing for me, either, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He squeezed my hand. Good, that was all he said. We stood there for a long time, holding hands under the star-dusted sky, the silence between us no longer empty, but full of a new and fragile hope. It was a beginning, a quiet one, a terrifying one, but a beginning nonetheless. The next morning was excruciating. Waking up felt like surfacing from a deep, transformative dream into a world that hadn't changed at all. The sheets on my bunk felt the same. The stale air of the bunkhouse smelled the same, and the groans of the other men rising for another day of work were the same. But I was fundamentally different. A wire had been tripped inside me, and now everything was humming with a new, terrifying frequency. At breakfast, I avoided his eyes. I couldn't look at him. I was afraid of what I would see, or worse, what I wouldn't see. Regret. Dismissal. A return to the cool, professional distance that had defined our relationship for months. I focused on my plate of eggs, shoveling them into my mouth without tasting them. The usual boisterous chatter of the mess hall was a dull roar in my ears. My entire consciousness was focused on the man sitting 2 seats down from me. I could feel his presence like a low-grade fever. I felt him stand up. I heard the scrape of his chair, the thud of his boots on the wooden floor. I kept my eyes down, bracing myself. He walked past me without a word. The knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. It was a mistake. Of course it was a mistake. I was a fool, a lonely, pathetic man who had read a universe of meaning into a single, impulsive act. I had built a fantasy, and now the sun was up, and it was dissolving like mist. I finished my coffee, the bitter liquid doing nothing to wake me from my stupor of dread, and went out to the barn to get my assignments for the day. My heart was a lead weight in my chest. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean by my own foolish hope. Cole was there, talking to one of the other hands about repairing a pump. He looked up as I entered, and his eyes met mine for a brief, unreadable second before he looked away again. The casualness of the glance was more painful than open rejection. It was a dismissal. It meant that what happened between us yesterday was so insignificant to him that it didn't even warrant a change in his behavior. He assigned me to a task on the far side of the property, working alone. Of course, he was putting distance between us. I just nodded, took the keys to the truck he offered without letting our fingers touch, and walked away, feeling smaller and more invisible than I had the day I first arrived. The silence I had once craved now felt like a punishment, a vast, echoing emptiness that mirrored the one inside me. I spent the day in a miserable haze, my thoughts a toxic, circling eddy of self-recrimination. I hammered posts with a vicious energy, trying to beat the disappointment out of my system. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, searching for clues I had missed. Had I been too eager? Had I misunderstood everything? The memory, which had been so vibrant and warm just hours before, now seemed tainted, a monument to my own stupidity. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and orange, I packed up my tools. The ride back to the ranch house was long and silent. I was dreading the evening, another meal in forced proximity, another night of torturing myself with what-ifs. I parked the truck and was heading towards the bunkhouse, my shoulders slumped in defeat, when I saw him. He was leaning against the corral fence, the same spot where I had first seen him all those months ago. He was just watching the horses, his face calm and unreadable in the fading light. He must have heard me, because he turned his head. He didn't smile, didn't beckon me over. He just watched me approach. I stopped a few feet away, my hands shoved in my pockets, my posture defensive. "Had a good day?" he asked, his voice even. "It was fine," I lied. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. The horses snorted softly, their breath misting in the cold air. "Leo," he said finally. He pushed himself off the fence and took a step towards me. "I'm sorry about this morning." I just stared at him, confused. "Sorry for what?" "For this," he gestured vaguely between us. "I don't know how to do this." In front of them, he looked over towards the bunkhouse, where the lights were coming on. "I've lived my whole life keeping my head down, keeping things separate. It's not you. It's me. I was a coward." The confession hung in the air, simple and devastatingly honest. The cold stone in my stomach began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, fluttering warmth. "Oh," was all I could manage to say. He took another step, closing the remaining distance between us. He reached out, Not for my hand this time, but for my arm. His grip was firm, grounding. "What happened yesterday?" he said, his voice low and intense, his eyes locked on mine. "That wasn't a mistake. Not for me. Was it for you?" I shook my head, unable to speak past the lump that had formed in my throat. "Good," he said again, that same single, solid word he had used the night before. A small smile touched his lips, the one that was just for me. "Then we just have to figure it out." He gave my arm a gentle squeeze, a silent reassurance that felt more powerful than any grand declaration. "Come on, let's get some dinner." He let go of my arm and started walking towards the mess hall. I stood there for a moment, watching him go, the world slowly coming back into focus. He wasn't rejecting me. He was scared, just like me. He was clumsy at this, just like me. The realization was a profound relief. I wasn't in this alone. We were two solitary men, trying to learn a new language together in the dark. A few days later, the test came. We were in the barn, a group of us, repairing tack. The mood was light, the banter easy. Jed, who had never seemed to like me much, was telling a crude story. It ended with a punchline that involved a homophobic slur. It was casual, unthinking, the kind of language that was probably common currency for him. The words landed in the air like stones. The other men chuckled, some uncomfortably. I felt myself freeze, the leather strap in my hands suddenly slick with sweat. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, the new guy, the quiet one from the city. I braced myself for the familiar sting of humiliation, the feeling of being other, of being wrong. I didn't look at Cole, but I was intensely aware of him. I waited for him to laugh along, to join in, to do anything that would put distance between himself and me, the potential liability. Instead, the barn fell silent. The laughter died in the men's throats. I risked a glance up. Cole had stopped his work. He was looking directly at Jed, his expression utterly flat, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "We don't use that word here, Jed," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a razor. Jed flushed, a blotchy red creeping up his neck. "Geez, Cole, it was just a joke. Don't get your panties in a twist." "It wasn't a joke," Cole said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming dangerously soft. "And you won't say it again. Understood?" There was a long, tense moment where no one moved. Jed, who was not a small man, seemed to shrink under Cole's gaze. He looked away first. "Yeah," he muttered, picking at a piece of straw on the floor. "Understood." Cole held his gaze for another second before turning back to his work as if nothing had happened. The other men quickly followed suit, the sudden burst of industry a transparent attempt to dispel the tension. But the message had been sent and received. I kept my head down, my heart pounding. He had done that for me. He hadn't made a scene, hadn't outed anyone. He had simply drawn a line in the sand. He had stood up, not just for me, but for a principle of decency. In that moment, my admiration for him solidified into something deeper, something stronger. It felt a lot like love. The season was drawing to a close. My temporary contract was almost up. The thought of leaving, of going back to my old, gray life, was now unbearable. This place, these mountains, this man, they had become my home in a way no place had ever been before. But I didn't know how to stay. I hadn't been offered anything permanent, and the thought of asking felt like an act of presumption. Cole had become more distant again in the last few days, a quietness settling over him that I couldn't penetrate. The fear returned, cold and sharp. Maybe this had just been a seasonal fling for him, a temporary comfort against the coming winter. Maybe he was waiting for me to leave, to make it easy for him. My last day was a Friday. I spent it saying my goodbyes, packing my single duffel bag. It felt heavier than it had when I arrived, weighted with unspoken feelings and the memory of a kiss on a fence line. Each handshake, each awkward farewell from the other hands, was another small nail in the coffin of the life I had briefly allowed myself to imagine. I saved my goodbye to Cole for last. I found him in the barn, brushing down his horse. The late afternoon light slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating him in a golden haze. "I'm heading out," I said, my voice sounding thin and weak to my own ears. He stopped what he was doing, but didn't turn around. I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Right," he said. "Well," I started, fumbling for words. "Thanks. For everything. For the job." He finally turned to face me. His expression was guarded, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat. "You're a good worker, Leo. You earned your keep." It felt like a dismissal, a final paycheck. My heart sank. This was it. It was over. "Okay, well, see you around, I guess," I mumbled, turning to leave before he could see the pathetic disappointment on my face. "Leo," his voice stopped me. I turned back. He had taken a few steps towards me. He looked lost, uncertain. It was an expression I had never seen on his face before. "The foreman's cabin is empty," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid they'd get stuck if he said them too slowly. "Old man Hemlock retired last spring. It's small, needs some work, but the roof is solid." I just stared at him, not understanding. "I need a permanent hand," he continued, his eyes pleading with me to understand what he couldn't say. "Someone who knows the property. Someone who isn't afraid of hard work. The pay's not great, but it's steady. Comes with the cabin." He was offering me a job, a reason to stay, but it was more than that. I could see it in the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability I had seen in the line shack during the storm. He wasn't just offering me a job. He was offering me a place, a future. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice strained. A slow smile spread across my face, a real one, full of a joy so bright it felt like it might crack me open. "Yes, Cole," I said, my voice finally steady. "It's a yes." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. He closed the remaining space between us in 2 long strides. He didn't kiss me. He just pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling that familiar scent of leather and dust and pine. It was the scent of home. I stayed. I moved into the small foreman's cabin, a cozy, dusty place that overlooked the main house. We worked on it together on the weekends, replacing warped floorboards, patching the roof, giving it a fresh coat of paint. We worked in a comfortable silence, our movements a familiar dance. And slowly, cautiously, we began to build a life. It wasn't a grand, cinematic romance. It was a thing of quiet moments. Making breakfast together in the early morning darkness before work, our hands brushing as we reached for the coffee pot. Sitting on the porch of my cabin at night, watching the stars, his shoulder pressed against mine. The first time he stayed the night, and I woke up in the middle of the night to find his arm thrown possessively over my waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. There were still things we didn't talk about, pasts we hadn't unpacked, but we were learning a new language, one made of shared glances, small touches, and comfortable silences. He taught me the names of the wildflowers that grew in the high pastures. I read to him from my books in the evenings by the light of the fire. He was the landscape, and I was finally learning how to live in it, no longer an observer, but a resident. One morning, I woke up early, just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a soft, pearly gray. Cole was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful in repose. I slipped out of bed and went to the window. The world was still and silent, holding its breath for the dawn. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The man looking back at me was someone I recognized, but also someone new. His face was leaner, tanner. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't had before, but his eyes were clear. The haunted, restless look was gone. He looked content. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Cole standing behind me, a blanket wrapped around his waist. He didn't speak. He just came to stand beside me, wrapping his arms around me from behind, pulling me back against his warm chest. We stood there together, watching the sun crest over the distant mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. I thought back to my old life, the noise, the grayness, the suffocating loneliness. It felt like a story about someone else, a ghost I had left behind. I had come here looking for silence, a place to disappear. And instead, in the quietest place on earth, I had found the one person who saw me, the one person who made me feel real. He had lifted me up, and he had never let me go. This was my new beginning, quiet and solid and true, unfolding one sunrise at a time. And it was more than I had ever dared to hope for.